At 4:45 a.m. on November 17, 1966, two policemen, Charles Hutchins and A.G. Huskey, were on duty patrolling the highway when a weird-looking gentleman approached them and engaged them in the weirdest conversation of their lives. Their guest was a 4-foot-tall man with the body of a 12-year-old. He wore a weird outfit made from shiny metal and had a rather bizarre way of speaking, carefully picking his words and giving off absolutely no accent, such that neither Hutchins nor Huskey could tell where this guy could be from. After ignoring most of the policeman's questions and asking numerous questions of his own, the weird man announced, "I will return in 2 days," after which he walked away, never to be seen or heard from again. Who was this man, and why didn't he return? Hutchins and Huskey's shift that auspicious morning started out like any other regular shift. The duo drove around, patrolling the West Buford Street extension in the rural section of Gaffney, South Carolina, like they did every other day. But as they approached a certain right-angle bend in the road, out of the darkness, bright lights from nowhere beamed directly into their faces, taking them aback for a couple of seconds. When the officers looked to the source of the light, they saw a metallic object, spherical in shape with a wide brim about 20 feet in diameter. The object had no portholes or visible light within it. It also barely touched the ground, hovering about 20 feet above instead. This was obviously some kind of craft, but where exactly could it have come from? Hutchins and Huskey continued to observe, stepping out of their patrol car to see the craft more clearly. Now standing in front of the object, the officers watched as a small door on the underside of the craft opened, revealing a short ladder. Seconds after, the duo saw a little man, or more correctly, a humanoid. The humanoid appeared out of the craft and descended from it using the ladder. Everything about this humanoid looked strange right off the bat. His outfit was a gold suit without any buttons or zippers, and while the suit itself wasn't luminous, it did reflect the headlights shining from the craft. The humanoid also had no helmet or headgear on, and Hutchins particularly recalled that he wasn't able to see the creature's feet, although they were standing in an area with lots of tall grass, which might have been the reason. But anyway, that wasn't the only thing strange about this creature. Hutchins also reported that though you could tell he wasn't a child, he did have the body of a 12-year-old, sporting a height of no more than 4 feet. When the humanoid started to speak, his speech had a preciseness to it. In fact, Hutchins said he spoke like a college graduate. Each word was pronounced painstakingly, and he tended to avoid answering questions thrown at him while asking numerous questions of his own. These questions, too, were just as weird as the being asking them. Because, for example, the creature wanted to know why the officers were dressed alike. But then, when he was asked where he was from, he simply laughed and ignored the question. Altogether, the conversation between the humanoid and the Gaffney officers lasted about 2 to 3 minutes, according to Hutchins. After that was done, the creature announced to Hutchins and Huskey that he would return in 2 days, after which he turned around and slowly started to make his way back to the craft. The craft took off like nothing that Hutchins and Huskey had ever seen. Particularly, Hutchins observed that the craft was exceptionally quiet, from the closing of the doors to the whirring of the engine. Unless you saw the craft with your eyes, you couldn't tell just by being within the vicinity that a craft of that magnitude was taking off. After the craft disappeared, Hutchins and Huskey, a little shaken by what they had just experienced, went back to their patrol car and drove back to the police department quietly. Later that day, they drove back to the area and searched thoroughly for clues that could explain the experience they had earlier that morning. Unfortunately, they found nothing except for a set of footprints that resembled those of a child. However, it is said that about 2 weeks later, two strange men showed up in Gaffney, staying in a local motel somewhere downtown. Locals reported that the two strange men went around asking people strange questions, which sounds similar to what the first visitor did. A short while later, the two men contacted Hutchins and Huskey, identifying themselves as some kind of doctors. Hutchins said he got the feeling that the men worked for the government. The men didn't say much to Hutchins and Huskey and left soon after the call, never to be seen or heard from again. Word about this weird incident got out when it was picked up by the local newspaper, and as expected, the reputations of Hutchins and Huskey took a major hit. Up until that point, both men had been upstanding men in the community. Hutchins had been in the force for about 6 months, while Huskey had been on for much longer, about 5 years. According to the news report, these were men whose testimonies were enough to sway a judge in the court of law because of how reputable they were in the community. However, when they began telling stories of an alien visitor in Gaffney, it didn't take long for public opinion of them to take a bit of a dive. Eventually, the encounter and the events that followed it proved too much for the two officers, and they decided to stop talking about it altogether. In fact, Huskey would retire altogether, choosing instead to open a small business in town. Whatever anyone had to say about these men's claims, one thing was sure: this was definitely not typical behavior. I mean, who suddenly quits a good and reputable job out of the blue with no prior hints whatsoever? The only reasonable explanation is that Huskey truly experienced what is called a high-impact event. A high-impact event is a kind of event that leads to significant and noticeable consequences when it occurs. High-impact events are typically unpredictable, irregular, and rare, often leading to a lot of disruption in the lives of those whom they affect. Considering this, how else do we classify a situation in which a police officer quits his job without any notice and opens a small business instead? That's definitely a disruption, and the argument of believers is that this was caused by a high-impact event. Specifically, Hutchins and Huskey's encounter with the Gaffney visitor on the morning of November 17, 1966. After Hutchins and Huskey's encounter made the news, leading UFOologist and journalist John Keel decided to investigate the story for himself. It took about a year, but in November 1967, Keel and his associate finally made contact with Charles Hutchins at the Gaffney police station. This was his conclusion after his interview with both Hutchins and Huskey. Hutchins appeared to be a straightforward, honest witness. There were many details he could not remember, and it seemed he did not attempt to embellish his story at all. His reputation in Gaffney was excellent. Careful cross-examination failed to uncover any discrepancies in his narrative. Later, we spoke to A.G. Huskey on the phone. We did not meet him. He confirmed Hutchins' story, but said he wanted to forget the whole thing. He had left the force and now operates his own business in Gaffney, a town of about 10,000. Neither Hutchins nor Huskey had read any UFO literature before the incident, nor do they seem very interested in such literature now. So obviously, neither Hutchins nor Huskey was lying, or at the very least, chances that they both lied about their encounter are very low. Still, is that enough to prove the Gaffney incident actually involved a UFO? Well, not exactly. Hutchins and Huskey might have been sincere, but isn't it also possible that they could have been sincerely wrong? Perhaps these upstanding men were hoaxed by some prankster and didn't actually talk to an alien. Could that be the case? Well, as we examine the evidence, you'll find the chances that Hutchins and Huskey were both hoaxed are quite unlikely. To begin with, the 1965 to 1967 period saw something of a UFO outbreak. In 1966 alone, we had the Dexter Hillsdale incident, where a total of 87 witnesses saw a UFO fly over McIntyre Hall. Then we saw a major sighting at Presque Isle State Park. And then, of course, who can forget the arrival of the Mothman in November of 1966? The point is, the Gaffney incident was far from an isolated event. In fact, quite the opposite. It fits very well into the happenings of its day. But even more to the point, around the time of the Gaffney incident, there were other reports of encounters all over America, in which individuals involved reported very similar experiences to what Hutchins and Huskey reported. For instance, in California, another police officer, Vern Morse, reported seeing a UFO flying over San Carlos at 11 p.m. on December 3, 1966. That is about 2 weeks after the Gaffney incident. But it gets even more interesting, because Morse also reported seeing a little occupant inside this UFO, although he didn't catch a close enough look at the entity to get a physical description. That same day, about 10 miles away at the San Francisco airport, Donald Bennett, supervisor of the airport's control tower, also reported observing strange lights in the sky. Bennett described the lights as red-orange glowing objects. He couldn't make out their shapes, but one thing he was sure of was that these objects were definitely not aircraft. Now, coming from someone who works as a control tower supervisor, that's definitely not an observation to discard. I could go on and on mentioning other sightings that were reported around the same time period, but I think you get the point by now. The point is, the period between 1965 and 1967 seemed to experience a form of UFO outbreak. All of these encounters couldn't possibly have been hoaxes, and seeing as the Gaffney incident fits right into the narrative of its time, there's little reason for us to doubt its authenticity. Besides, some of the experiences Hutchins and Huskey recounted after their sighting track with known reports of alien encounters. Keel's interview with the Gaffney officers revealed some strange things. For instance, neither officer could remember the conversation they had with the alien, even though it was a very short conversation that barely lasted 2 to 3 minutes, according to them. Now, how could they have forgotten a brief conversation with such a remarkable creature who appeared to them under mysterious circumstances? Well, as you're probably already familiar with, memory loss is a common experience with alien contactees. Memory loss and missing time. By now, you've probably heard of Betty and Barney Hill and their experience when they were abducted by aliens. The two had been driving back to New Hampshire from Montreal when they spotted a UFO trailing them. Shortly after, the UFO landed in front of them and a couple of aliens approached their vehicle. That was the last thing they remembered before coming to and realizing that they were several miles away from where they saw the UFO, even though they had no recollection of driving that significantly long distance. To make matters worse, by the time they got home, they realized that they had lost close to 3 hours. That is, 3 hours of their trip they simply couldn't account for. It wasn't until Betty and Barney were put under hypnosis that they were able to find out that they had been abducted by aliens. Now, to be clear, neither Hutchins nor Huskey reported any missing time, but at the same time, you'd have to agree that an entity going through all that trouble to make an appearance and then going on to have nothing more than a 2-minute conversation is somewhat weird. Plus, it doesn't track with known cases of alien encounters, especially in cases where the humanoid actually makes contact with a person. So, what if Hutchins and Huskey lost time but just didn't realize it? Now, someone might respond and say that lost time, by virtue of its nature, is always noticeable. Betty and Barney, for instance, realized that they had lost time because they got home about 3 hours later than they should have. But is that always the case? What if the time lost was not so much? Think about it. If the amount of time they lost was only 15 to 20 minutes, that's not a huge time gap. Even if they checked their time and it looked like they had lost that much time, 20 minutes of lost time is easily explained away, so it wouldn't have registered as such a big deal. However, when you square it with the narrative Hutchins and Huskey paint, it does make more sense to say that the alien arrived and talked with them for about 15 to 20 minutes, but then they forgot about it, just like most alien contactees often do. Of course, someone could say this is just conjecture, but we could argue that this conjecture is based on somewhat reliable data. On the one hand, we have data from alien contact testimonies, mentioning memory loss and missing time. Secondly, Hutchins and Huskey themselves reported memory loss. These are their words, not mere speculations. So, on that basis, the theory isn't completely baseless. Internal clues within the testimonies of the witnesses themselves provide reasonable basis to assume that Hutchins and Huskey very likely missed time as well. Now, let's talk about the two visitors who came back to Gaffney 2 weeks later. Hutchins reports that after his interaction with the Gaffney visitor, the humanoid told him that he'd be back in 2 days, but that he never saw nor heard from the being again. But then, just 2 weeks later, odd-looking men from nowhere appeared in town and started asking the townspeople weird questions. Now, there are 2 ways we can interpret this event, and in my opinion, the second interpretation seems more likely than the first. But you can hear both and let me know what you think down in the comments. Okay, so here's the first interpretation, and it brings to mind something that Hutchins mentioned in passing while talking to Keel. During Keel's interviews with Hutchins, Hutchins explained to the journalist that the humanoid had said he'd be back in 2 days, but never showed. Hutchins also added, on a lighter note, that he didn't know how the humanoid measured time. It's a small comment, and Hutchins himself might not have thought much of it, but it's definitely worth diving into. So let's explore this rabbit hole. As humans, we mark time by the rotation of the Earth around the Sun, changes in the Moon, and changes in season. Our sleep cycles and circadian rhythm are also the results of our biology, which might even be unique to us as Earthlings. Now consider an entity that lives in a different part of the universe, with a very different set of conditions. Imagine the planet they live on rotates faster or slower than ours. It's also possible that their circadian rhythms are longer or shorter than those of us Earthlings. In such a context, it's not far-fetched to imagine that such an entity in such a context would have a different concept of time from ours. Which means that it's possible that when the humanoid told Hutchins and Huskey he'd be back in 2 days, he didn't mean 2 days by our human earthly count. Perhaps on the alien's planet, 1 day is much longer than 24 earthly hours. Perhaps a day on his planet adds up to 1 week of our time, which would mean that he probably came back, as he said, just not within the time frame Hutchins expected, because the humanoid had a different concept of time from us Earthlings. Besides, don't forget the other reports of sightings that happened exactly 2 weeks after the Gaffney incident. A police officer in California and a control tower supervisor in the San Francisco airport, 2 reliable witnesses, both reported seeing a UFO. In fact, the police officer reported seeing something like a humanoid inside the UFO he sighted. So could this have been the humanoid making his return as promised? Probably. Anyway, as you can see, it's not completely outside the realm of possibility. But even at that, I'd grant that it's still a bit of a stretch. So, in my opinion, What seems more likely is that this was the classic Men in Black case. Again, if you're familiar with stories of UFO sightings, you probably also know that witnesses often mention being harassed by men in black after their encounter. Now remember that Hutchins mentioned that the two strange men called him at his office, claiming to be doctors and interrogating him somewhat. Residents who encountered the men also commented that the men looked and acted strange, which obviously lines up with testimonies of alien sightings and contact we've seen. What then happened to the humanoid, and why didn't he return in 2 days as he claimed? Well, what if he did, but he just didn't return to Gaffney? The fact that neither Hutchins nor Huskey ever saw the humanoid again does not mean that he didn't return. After all, the location of the humanoid's return would depend on what his mission was the second time around. Plus, the humanoid never said he would return to Hutchins or Huskey specifically. Perhaps the second part of his mission did not involve Hutchins, Huskey, or Gaffney, in which case there would be no need for the humanoid to come back to them. Ultimately, this summarizes the argument from the believers' camp. But of course, there are always two sides to every story. Because while the alien theory sounds convincing, there are a number of factors hastily overlooked in a bid to establish it. The most glaring factor overlooked in proposing the alien theory is the lack of concrete proof. Many conjectures and speculations can be made, but the truth remains that there isn't any concrete evidence to prove that Hutchins and Huskey actually encountered an alien. In fact, the one window Hutchins and Huskey had to gather some evidence was missed altogether. Hutchins said that he and Huskey returned to the location of the sighting the very next day and found some footprints. This could have presented a perfect opportunity to make a cast and thereby produce concrete evidence for this incredible encounter Hutchins and Huskey claimed to have. But for some reason, they didn't. Cynics might say that this absence of evidence is proof of absence. In other words, Hutchins and Huskey both made up the story about their encounter. However, if we're going to give both men a fair shake, judging from their behavior after the encounter, we have to admit that it doesn't seem likely that they made up their encounter. What evidence seems to suggest is that these men sincerely experienced something. It's just that there are several other more realistic explanations within reach that could just as well explain the Gaffney incident without having to reach for a theory as incredible as an alien encounter. For instance, the two officers could have been suffering from electromagnetic field-induced hallucinations. It's been observed that the brain tends to experience electrical spikes when a person is in or around a strong electromagnetic field. These spikes could cause severe hallucinations or even seizures in extreme cases. And who's to say that that isn't what happened to Hutchins and Huskey? You could say it's far-fetched, but if you want to dismiss this theory on that basis, then you'd have to dismiss the alien theory as well, because both theories are similarly hard to prove. Another explanation some might give is that the UFO and the humanoid that stepped out of it were simply part of a secret government project. And to be honest, the government has definitely earned its reputation on that score. I mean, MK Ultra, anybody? Still, if you ask me, this theory is quite far-fetched, but maybe you have a different opinion. Let me know down in the comments. Meanwhile, what I find even more problematic for the alien theory is the lack of supporting witnesses. Of course, this singular fact does not discredit Hutchins and Huskey's testimony. But with no concrete evidence, the lack of independent witnesses to authenticate the officers' sightings makes the alien theory that much harder to prove. Sure, it was reported that two strange men appeared in Gaffney 2 weeks later, stayed in a local motel, and then went around town asking people strange questions. But there's no proof of that. No specific name was ever given for the motel, no motel receipts, and no specific person came forward to say that they were questioned by any strange men. Nothing at all of the sort. Just the words of a report in a magazine. There's just not enough evidence to prove that the Gaffney incident was indeed an alien sighting. In fact, while we're on this point, there's even hardly any information about this incident online at all. Just brief mentions in a couple of publications and the investigative report by John Keel. Of course, there's no way to prove without a doubt that Hutchins and Huskey didn't encounter an alien. That's the burden of proving a negative. Nevertheless, when we take all the counter-arguments presented by the skeptical side, you've got to admit that the skeptics make a good point. Believing these two Gaffney officers saw an alien requires a huge leap of faith. But that's the thing with this incident. Even disbelieving the Gaffney officers also requires a leap of faith. Everything they did and said after their alleged encounter is consistent with what you'd expect from someone who really had an encounter as disruptive as an alien visitation. Not once did the two officers change their story. Neither of them showed any interest in UFO literature either before or after the incident, and neither of them went to the media with the story, so they couldn't have been making the whole thing up for money or something. Not only that, one of them completely quit the force after the encounter, specifically because he was tired of all the negative attention his encounter got him. This is not typical behavior. So what else do you chuck all of these up to, other than that these men actually experienced something life-changing? I mean, any alternative theory to this would require just as much of a leap of faith to believe as the alien theory. So on what basis would you reject these credible men's testimonies? Why not just take these men at their word? Especially since up until that point, these men were known to have a good reputation. Of course, ultimately, the decision is yours to make. So let me know what you think about this odd incident by leaving a comment down below. Meanwhile, if you'd like to know the story that started it all in the tradition of alien encounters and abductions, then be sure to check out this video about Betty and Barney Hill.